Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Content warning for child death and racism.
Our episode today details the wrongful imprisonment of James Joseph Richardson in 1968, following the deaths of his 7 children in 1967 by poisoning with the insecticide Parathion in a small town in Florida. Richardson was a black fruit picker in Arcadia, Florida, which sits in DeSoto County an hour east of Sarasota, and at the time of the crime had a population of less than 6,000, of which only around 20% were black folks, and the KKK marched in the local Christmas parade.
Nice.
Yeah, so we're getting a flavor for what's going on.
We're setting the scene a little bit.
Yeah.
And it looks a little dreary.
It is. Yeah. And unfortunately, Richardson sat on death row for 21 years following this crime, the tragic loss of his children, and then the complete miscarriage of justice that played out in that Florida court. State and city officials maintained their positions on his conviction even after appeals were made and evidence of his innocence was brought to light in public. This abuse of power was not left in the previous century and continues to be perpetrated against minorities, especially black people, in prisons across the country to this day. So, let's jump into it. Our main source today is the book Arcadia Revisited by Mark Lane, who is the lawyer who came to represent Richardson while he waited on death row. It is a weird read. It's got a self-published feel to it. Mm-hmm. But he was there and did speak to Richardson. So yeah, I think it's a strange read, but it's got a lot of the information that we're looking for.
Okay.
So at noon on Wednesday, October 25th, 1967, several black children were taken to the hospital in Arcadia, Florida by their teachers. The police were called because of the number of children affected, but at the time, it was believed that they were experiencing ptomaine poisoning from the school cafeteria. Do you remember? Yeah.
No, what is
ptomaines?
No.
So we've discussed ptomaine poisoning briefly before in the Dr. Holly Crippen episode.
Okay.
So Crippen was tried in 1910, and already by then the idea of ptomaine bacteria like putrescine and cadaverine that, were thought to be formed from decaying matter, and that this is what caused foodborne illness. This was already pretty much disproven by 1910, but, science is slow to get around, and it takes a long time to creep into the nooks and crannies of small towns like this, especially, pre-internet. Mm-hmm. So all these kids end up sick. They think there must have been a ptomaine, a foodborne,
some kind of foodborne illness.
Yeah, at the school.
At the cafeteria, yeah.
Exactly. Authorities realized all of the sick children were from the Richardson family, at which point it was determined that they must have been poisoned by something at home because they went home to eat lunch rather than staying at school and eating lunch.
Okay.
So Lieutenant Joseph Minigan, Sheriff Frank Klein, and Police Chief Richard Barnard searched the family home to find poison and prevent further exposure. And though they did find and retain a can of spray insecticide, they did not think that this was the culprit at the time. That was just the only thing that they were like, it could be this, and so they grabbed it. Mm-hmm. And allegedly, very allegedly, the home smelt strongly of metal, like aluminum or copper in the air. And Sheriff Frank Klein, later stated that he immediately recognized the smell as Parathion.
Is this a common smell? Like, do people know what this smells like? Because I've never even heard of this before.
They might have been familiar with the smell because of, like, the agriculture businesses around, and so they might have been familiar with it because of its use in groves. And I think maybe he had some story of, like, I smelled it when I was a kid or something like that, working in the fields. But he didn't mention it at the time. He wasn't like, whoa, that's a strong smell. Like, I think that's Parathion.
I know what this is.
Yeah. And nobody else seems to have noticed a smell in the air. And it wasn't until he was like, not even questioned. It wasn't until he gave his statement later that he was like, oh, I had a gut instinct that it was parathion, and that was definitely what it was, and like,
Okay.
didn't mention it at the time.
Right.
So everywhere was searched. They searched the home 5 times on the day of the poisoning, and they searched the shack behind the apartment building to no avail. They don't even find anything out bad in this like storage shed that could have been anything useful. The Richardsons' next door neighbor, 32-year-old Betsy Reese, was interviewed when they were going around looking for stuff. They actually, when the teachers and the cops went to the apartment, she was actually standing on the porch with a child in her arms, and another one was at her feet, and they were like seizing and experiencing symptoms. So she was found with the kids, and she stated when she was asked, like, what happened? Do you know? She was like, yeah, I'm taking care of the Richardson kids today. I made them lunch when they came home from school. And that meant that she just heated up the leftover rice, beans, and grits that their mother had prepared the night before and then, like, kind of set aside, like, this is their lunch for the day.
Mm-hmm.
So it was soon after eating this meal that the children fell ill, and police thought that Reese would prove to be the most important witness on the case. And I think witness is a weird thing to call the one woman who was like...
Who fed them.
Yeah.
Prior
already...
to the sickness.
Yeah, it's like, this seems like a red flag already.
Right. I agree.
Yeah.
Like,
whatever. But they're also like, most poisoning cases are accidental, so it's probably accidental. So I think they're also not like trying to point fingers. They want to find who is responsible, but they're not like, you poisoned these kids. They're thinking this is a complete and total like tragic accident.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No ill intent.
Right. Mark Lane wrote that when police were searching the home, they also interviewed Dorothy Bracy, who was Reese's daughter. But I'm wondering if this is a misremembrance or if they interviewed her later or what time of the day this was, because Dorothy Bracy was supposed to watch the kids before. Like, she was asked like a couple days ahead of time, like, can you watch the kids on Wednesday? And I think something suddenly came up like Tuesday night where she was like, I can't, I have to go to Sarasota. And so then
I'll get my mom to do it.
Right. And so Betsy did it.
Okay.
But whatever, they see Dorothy and they're like, hey, Dorothy, will you make sure no one gets into this apartment while we're gone?
Oh, no.
And like, I know it's 1967, but it's also like, it was 1967 already. Like,
right.
Yeah. By this time, the children are already being taken care of at the hospital. When they leave to go see the children again, many of them had already died, and those who hadn't died were suffering from severe convulsions. So at this point, food poisoning's definitely ruled out. They're like, it's not the ptomaines.
Right.
So James and Annie Mae Richardson, the parents, worked as fruit pickers in a citrus grove that was about 16 miles away. So a message had to be sent to them physically to say, hey, one of your kids is sick. You're allowed to leave work to go care for them. That is the message they got when like 7 of their children are dying at the hospital.
Right. And some have already passed. Well, I don't know if they'd already passed at that point, but yeah, it's a serious situation like that we're dealing with.
Right. But despite this like kind of casual, like, one of your kids is sick and you need to go home, they both decided to pack up and go. And they, they're more by the bushel workers. And so they're both going to lose wages. But it seemed like they were very intensely passionate people. This is not either of their first marriage. And actually, some of these 7 children are Annie Mae's children from a past marriage. And then some of them are James's. But they are very passionate, very intense. There's a little bit of on again, off again. But like, for the most part, they're all about each other and they do everything together. Like, when they have to go physically go pay the rent every month, they go together and pay the rent. They're just like always together. So they pack up and they leave together. And when they get to the hospital, instead of being able to immediately see their children, they are greeted by Sheriff Klein. And he starts to question them, and he doesn't tell them that at this point, 6 of their 7 children had died.
Oh my God.
So this was 8-year-old Betty, 7-year-old Alice, 6-year-old Susie, 5-year-old Doreen, 4-year-old Vanessa, and 2-year-old James Jr.
Wow.
He asks the Richardsons for the keys to their apartment. Even though they'd already gained access, they were looking for anything else that might be locked or that they need to gain access to. So James gives them the keys and includes the keys to his front door, as well as keys to the locks on 2 fridges in the apartment.
Right.
And one fridge is a normal fridge that has a lock on it. I don't know.
Reasons?
I guess when you have 7 children and you're like wage workers at this time, you might need to like make sure they're not getting in and eating all the food. I don't know.
Sure.
It would look different now, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like it looks a little Ruby Frank, but I don't think it did back then, you know.
Okay.
And then they had a second fridge that didn't work, and so it was kind of just used as like an additional shelving to hold food that didn't need to be refrigerated. So they hand over all of these keys, and then they're told, okay, thanks for your keys, thanks for cooperating, 6 of your kids are dead. And as you would think, Annie Mae becomes hysterical, and she has to be sedated. And this is used against James later, but he denies it. He's like, no, that can't be. And then he doesn't really have this, like, big reaction to it. He kind of just has denial. And then he just kind of sits staring off into space and, like, mumbling and praying quietly to himself. So they think it's an
kind
act.
of shutting down.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, but, like, now we know, like, that's just somebody who's, like, freezing. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like, there are all types of reactions to news like that.
Yeah. And I feel like this is a guy who has experienced, like, a lot of shit in his life. And so I don't think, and, you know, maybe he's experienced big reactions and it's just not served him. It could be a masculinity thing where he's just, like, having a small reaction. Mm-hmm. Or it could just be that the weight of his 6 dead children is just, like, you know, he's
too
offline.
Impressive that he can, like, react in any way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get him.
Word of the deaths drew reporters from across Florida. Frank Klein and Judge Hayes held press conferences about the case, and James Richardson himself was repeatedly questioned by media as to how his children had died. And he told them that he did not know, quote, but the sheriff better find out. That's his job, unquote. And Sheriff Klein did not appreciate him saying this. I don't know if this is the turning point of the story, but Klein did not appreciate him, like, throwing him under the bus like that at all, which, like, it is his fucking job.
It is his job. Like, that's literally your job, is to, like, find people who commit crimes, and this is a serious crime.
Yeah, and you're holding press conferences about it, so, like, you're putting the onus on yourself. Like,
right. When you're saying, like, this is a big deal, but not a big deal for me to figure out.
Right. So, the case is still being treated as an accident, and I don't know if that, like, really will play into it a whole lot. Like, if it had just come out as, like, a big accident, I don't know if it would have changed much, just because it was 7 dead children, but it was 7 dead black children, and they were the children of, like, black fruit pickers. I don't know how things would have played out. Mm-hmm. But it did bring people out of the woodwork to solve this case. It was a big deal, this, like, mass death. And so this included investigators from the state attorney general's office, the state agricultural and health departments, and even prosecuting attorney Frank Schaub made a point to show himself fresh off of his victory over F. Lee Bailey in a widely publicized double murder poisoning trial that involved succinylcholine chloride. He was like, I'm the, like, big man in town, and I'm putting myself on this case. Like, it was a big deal.
Okay.
And all of this support from all over the state meant that Sheriff Klein was able to pick and choose who he had working the case. And he chose to remove Police Chief Richard Barnard, who was one of the first people on the scene.
You might think that that would be a critical person to keep involved.
You'd think. Maybe. And Klein may have done this because the 2 men clashed in their beliefs regarding the public relations aspect of this case. Barnard was like, I don't know that you should be doing these press conferences. Like, doesn't look good. Mm-hmm. Or it could have been that Klein felt empowered enough to remove the 1 black officer in all of Arcadia from this case.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is all day one. This is all day one. It's highly publicized. People are talking about it. The next day, October 26th, 3-year-old Diane Richardson dies. The apartment building was searched again, and this time a 2-pound sack of Parathion was found at the Richardson home that everyone involved unanimously agreed had not been there during the previous 5 searches of the home.
Okay.
Now, the Associated Press, in their reporting on it, said that the sack had been found on the steps of the home, but that's not true. In reality, it was found in that shed out back. And although the shed was dry on the inside, the bottom of the bag was damp, like it had been removed from a dewy place before being discovered. And this, air quotes, discovery was made by apartment resident Charlie Smith, according to Betsy Reese. So, according to the sketchy neighbor, this guy Charlie Smith, who is kind of derided as the town drunk, is the guy who made the discovery.
Oh, fantastic. Super reliable.
But police reports indicate that the discovery was called in by an anonymous male caller. And then, during their search of the home, they found a business card for an insurance salesman. And they do their questioning, and they discover that James Richardson had discussed life insurance policies for all of the children with salesman George Purvis the night before the murders. Like, immediately before the murders.
Oh, no.
Right, yeah. But also nobody asks, like, did you call this guy? Or was he just traveling door to door? Like, they...
Right, because that's fair. Like, poor timing.
Yeah.
Poor timing.
Yeah, and they do not ask. They're just like, you talked
totally
about...
possible.
Yeah. Yeah. But still, they're like, well, we don't know. We don't know. It still could be an accident because the analysis on the children's food in their bodies hasn't been done yet. So we don't know yet. A couple days pass. The mass funeral for the children was held on Sunday, October 29th at the local high school's gymnasium because there was no church in town that was big enough to handle the crowd that was expected to turn out.
Oh, wow.
And there were a lot of people that came to pay their respects to these children. More than 1,000 people attended. And while a hymn was sang for the children, James collapsed in tears. Annie Mae at this point appeared calmer, and who knows if she was still being sedated or what. But by the end of the service, she also collapses. These people are just destroyed by this major loss. And then the children were buried together, side by side, in the segregated cemetery. News media nationwide covered the funeral, not only in press, but also in radio and TV coverage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
Big deal.
The entire country is waiting for Sheriff Frank Klein to bring justice to these poor children. So, like, the pressure's on. And according to Police Chief Barnard, the guy who was taken off, Klein saw the chance to make a big name for himself. He needed to make an arrest real bad.
I can already...
Are you seeing how things are going from
yeah,
here already?
I mean, yeah, it's pretty clear. It was pretty clear as soon as he pulled Barnard off the case, like, where this was going.
Yeah.
Like, but...
So 2 days
even
after...
more so now.
2 days after the funeral, Klein charged James Joseph Richardson with 7 counts of first-degree murder. And if convicted, in Florida in 1967, this meant death penalty by electric chair. Barnard believed there was no case against Richardson, and John Treadwell of the state attorney's office also agreed. He was like, there is nothing here. Like, we have the words of a couple officers, and we've basically not talked to anybody else. Like, there's just no case here. Klein had acted without proper consultation and had basically done this entire thing himself. He had decided to press charges himself. And so just as suddenly as the charges were brought against Richardson, they were dropped. But they were replaced with child neglect charges against both James and Annie Mae.
Oh, wow.
So they were both held on bond with bail set at $5,000, which is roughly $47,000 in today's money. And County Judge Hayes admitted that they wouldn't honor it even if it were paid. Like, sure, we're setting bail, but we're not going to actually, like, honor that.
Doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Klein announced to the press that he and Hayes believed there was actually enough evidence to file murder charges. So they ordered murder warrants and summoned a coroner's inquest into the case to substantiate the evidence that Barnard and Treadwell would both be needed to concur on before the case would go to trial. So now he needs these two people who are like, you don't have any, like, you have no evidence for this case.
Right.
This is a nothing case. Klein told the press that he couldn't give details about this case in particular, but that he believed that Mr. Richardson had motive because he had turned up details about 5 other children in his care that mysteriously died in another city in Florida. But I can't talk about it right now. So he's telling the newspapers this, but then is being like, well, on the record, I can't really talk about it. So,
like, what do you think you're doing when you're talking to the record?
Yeah.
Okay.
But he was able to say that he believed that the motive, very simply, was the $14,000 in life insurance, which is just over $132,000 today. And in addition, he revealed that the Richardsons had both agreed to lie detector tests, which showed that James had guilty knowledge of the poisoning.
Okay.
Yeah. Polygraph tests are generally not admissible in court. I don't believe they've ever been admissible in court.
Mm-hmm.
Both the prosecution and the defense have to agree to them when they are submitted to courts. But they're not scientifically reliable because they're accurate 60 to 90% of the time. And that's not a great spread. Like,
no, it's not. It is not a good vibe. Like, there are too many ways, like, that it can be misconstrued.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, it's not an exact science. Like,
no. Mm-mm.
Like, I think, like, could they be used as an interrogation tool to, sure, to, like, try to put some pressure on somebody? But as far as in court, I do not think they belong.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you'd have to say, like, an interrogation, not, like, on the polygraph it showed, you know?
Right.
Like,
exactly. You would have to be clear about that. Like,
and I don't even know if you can, like submit as evidence or, like, say in your statements, like, well, they wouldn't submit to a polygraph because, like, it just puts you in such a stupid bind, like, having them exist does.
right.
Where it's like, if you say no because you're smart and you shouldn't submit to a polygraph test, then you look guilty. But if you say yes and then they fuck up the results, you look guilty.
You look guilty. Yeah, it's quite the rock in a hard place. Like,
yeah. We just want so badly to, like, be able to, like, know when someone's lying. And it's like,
I know, and it's just not a thing.
No,
it's just not a thing.
There's no truth serum. There's nothing like that.
No.
Like, so this bullshit coroner's jury was hand-selected by Judge Hayes and commenced on November 2nd. The press was encouraged to attend, and because DeSoto County does not require or did not require stenographic records of testimony, this the press coverage from these reporters that attended is all we have to rely on. It's all Mark Lane was able to reference, for better or for worse. So what this coverage reveals to us is that this hearing was overseen by a judge who already believed the defendant to be guilty. It allowed presentation of quote-unquote evidence by Sheriff Klein in the form of an undocumented phone call from detectives in Jacksonville in relation to that 5 to 6 children he alluded to, who...
5 to 6, like...
Yeah, right, we don't know.
It's odd that we don't have an exact number about the amount of children who died.
Yeah, yeah. And, like... They say that they were sick from exposure to fertilizer, and some allegedly died, but it seems unclear. And it's bullshit that they still allowed it to be admitted into evidence for this coroner's inquiry. And then Richardson wasn't even represented at this hearing, which I don't get. Miranda rights were already enshrined in U.S. law the year prior, so he had the right to representation, but He himself was not even at this hearing. They're talking about him and he's not there.
Oh, so. Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So he can't even, make like an attempt to represent himself
No.
in this
No.
situation. Yeah,
No.
that's pretty awful.
Also, despite Betsy Reese being considered the best witness they had on the case, she was barely questioned as to the particulars of the morning of the deaths, and she was merely asked to recollect how she served the children food. Reese was asked about finding the sack, and she recalled finder Charlie Smith saying, "Bet there was some of that Parathion around if we'd just go look for it," and then walking directly to the shed.
Oh my god.
Like, why would he be saying Parathion? Why is anyone thinking Parathion at this point?
I don't know either. Like that's like yeah.
And then
it seems to me, I don't know how obscure, but it seems to me to be a pretty obscure thing to like.
I don't even know. Like, if you were unfortunate enough to have a neighbor who like is sickened or dies or something, and you've heard rumors about it, I don't even know what the fuck you would say. You wouldn't be like, "Oh, I bet there's cyanide if we just go looking for it." Like,
I know. Like, what a weird thing to say.
So
what a
highly
weird
specific
thing to say.
Yeah.
And then go find said thing.
Right.
Like, yourself. Like, not involve, like, law enforcement.
Yeah, not be like, "I have a suspicion that the murder weapon is in the shed, so I'm going to call the police again." Like,
no, like, I'm on the case.
Which, like...
Me, Charlie Smith.
Which I guess people do that, and they're like, "I'm going to sleuth around and find out." And
sure.
I don't fucking know, man.
Sure, but the town drunk being like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, boys. Like,
yeah, with the suspicious neighbor.
Yeah, right.
And then,
okay.
According to Reese's testimony, she says that they find the sack, and then a woman sees them with the sack and calls the police. But a male caller is identified in the police logs as calling it in. Somebody is lying.
Somebody somewhere. I wonder who.
Yeah. 3 doctors and 1 nurse who treated the children testified about their symptoms and said that they believed they were suffering from exposure to an organic phosphate, possibly Parathion, because it's in that family. Charlie Smith was questioned, though vaguely, and on the stand, he reiterated seemingly everything that Reese said and without any further detail. Just like, yep, corroborating what she says. And then they're like, "Well, he's the drunk." Like, not in court, but like the newspapers were like, "He's a drunk, so you can't trust anything he says." And it's like, I feel like I've never really had the experience of witnessing or reading about a true kangaroo court before, and that is just exactly what happens every time, like, court proceeds in this case. It's just a kangaroo court.
Gotcha.
So, they find that insurance salesman, Gerald George Purvis, was called to testify about his visit to the Richardson home on Tuesday the 24th, and he was still not asked if he was soliciting from door to door or if James had intentionally invited him over. Which seems like the key thing to ask this guy.
Like, very important thing to ask this guy.
Like, the one thing you would ask this guy.
Like, what did you talk about? Why were you there?
Yeah, why?
Like,
yeah.
Like,
no. He was only asked what he said to James and what James said to him. Which is like, so you put this guy up to testify, and then you just have him, like, give his sales pitch to you? Like,
right.
Purvis testified that James said there were 10 in his family, and during the conversation, both Annie Mae and Reese were present. When it came time to pay the premium for the insurance that I guess he agreed to, like, right then and there, the Richardsons didn't have the money, and they asked Reese if they could borrow some money. But she didn't have it either, so Purvis said he'd be back next week. And at this point in the testimony, Treadwell insisted that Purvis had left the Richardsons, primarily James, with the impression that there was a valid policy in place. Like, he left, like, "I'll put this in place until you can pay for it," or, like, you know, in a week's time, it'll lapse or something. But Purvis denied that he had created that impression, although he agreed that James might have believed that, which seems superfluous.
Okay, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
This whole part is weird. Like,
this whole thing is weird.
I mean, the whole thing is weird. Like, and just like off, but like this is like, okay.
Yeah.
Why? All right. Anyway.
So, after this very vague line of questioning with Purvis, the pathologist testified, but not with new evidence, because it had already been revealed prior to November 2nd in the papers that parathion was found in the stomachs of the children and on some of the utensils taken from the Richardson home. And so Reese's and Smith's story, like, well, I bet it's parathion, that was probably influenced by the news media. Like, it's not like they're, like, quarantining these people off. Like, they're still being exposed to, like,
everything out there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, not only did the pathologist not introduce any new evidence in this coroner's inquest, no new evidence was presented during this thing. James Richardson, like I said, he wasn't there, so he wasn't cross-examined. He wasn't, like, present as a human man being tried. But also his name was barely mentioned. So it's like we had this coroner's inquest, and it's like, well, we've already proven that the children are dead, and we've already proven that they're dead because of poison. So we're trying to find the person, but we're hardly even talking about the person that we're, like, committed to, like, setting to trial, you know?
Right. The person that is on trial for this, like...
Yeah.
The person who did it, like, why are we not talking about him?
Right.
Like, or naming him. You know what I mean? Like...
Yeah, we're just talking around it and, like, circumstantially being like, well, it must be him.
It must be.
Yeah.
Must be.
A half an hour after testimony completed, the jury came back with a unanimous verdict of death with premeditation at the hands of James Richardson and party or parties unknown. Charlie Smith was arrested and held as a material witness with a bond set at $2,000. I know.
What?
Like, why are we arresting the witnesses?
Yeah, that doesn't... I'm so confused.
Yeah.
Okay.
Although Treadwell had thought that there was not enough evidence to try the case against Richardson, the Attorney General's office was now bound by the findings, as was prosecuting attorney Frank Schaub, who was essentially in the same boat. So, I don't know if they could have done the right thing. Like, you can always do the right thing, right? But, like, the people who they work for and represent are now of the opinion, as prosecutors, that this man is, you know, very likely guilty and needs to be taken to court, to trial.
Mm-hmm.
But also, these are both people who are elected to their positions. And so now the votes are on the line.
Voters.
Yeah. If Mark Lane's experience with the people of Arcadia is any indication, no one believed that James Richardson killed his own children. But no one had the power to stand up to Frank Klein, especially none of the black citizens of Arcadia. Even the local NAACP felt powerless against the sheriff, though this is possibly because their leader was a special deputy to Sheriff Klein, and he didn't believe that this posed a conflict of interest at all.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, like, once Richardson ends up in this system, like, he doesn't stand a fucking chance.
Right.
The mass publicity of the coroner's jury allowed attorney John S. Robinson to learn of the case, and he had already previously worked with the Florida NAACP. And so he calls them up, and he's like, I just want to add my name to the list of attorneys who are willing to represent Richardson. And Richardson actually chose Robinson to represent him, possibly because his name sounded like Richardson. And so Richardson was just like, oh, we have, like, similar names. So Robinson represents him in pretrial. And when they're talking and getting ready for trial, Richardson explained to Robinson that Klein was calling him racial slurs and pushing him around. And initially, Robinson thought that the authorities maybe had a good case against Richardson, and that's why they were taking him to trial. But eventually he changed his opinion because he met Richardson and was like, he wouldn't hurt anybody and I would trust him with my own kids.
Mm.
And then on their third meeting, Robinson got a tip from another inmate that Sheriff Klein had bugged Richardson's cell. And so Robinson checked behind the radiator and found a microphone that appeared to corroborate this.
Oh, wow.
And then into it, he said something like, "I know you're listening, Sheriff," like something like that.
Damn.
Yeah. And so now also, like, Frank Klein is, like, aware that, like, I know that you know that I know.
Yeah, he's cooked. He's cooked.
Robinson believes Richardson is completely innocent. And when Richardson asked him to present him for his full trial, not just pretrial stuff, he agrees to it. And Robinson knows it's going to be hard won, mostly though because of the environment and not because of the evidence. Because Robinson's like, there is no evidence against Richardson.
Hmm.
Robinson is actually quoted as saying,
We weren't observing a judicial proceeding, but pre-election maneuvering.
to bring order back to the proceedings and make it more like a normal court, Robinson Robinson filed a writ of habeas corpus. Do you know what habeas corpus is? A writ of habeas corpus?
It's something along the lines of like somebody being able to have proper representation,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So he, as his custodian, is asking him to be brought before the court to determine if the detention is lawful. Like, this guy is real. Tell me why he's being detained. Which has not been the fucking case up to now.
No,
you know?
he hasn't even been like treated like a person.
No.
Like literally, physically, emotionally, like
Yeah.
he's not there and also being mistreated at the
Right.
same time.
Right.
Like when he is around, like and a part of the proceedings, like
Yeah.
in any fashion.
In his application, Robinson asserted that county officials actually had evidence which would exonerate Richardson, beyond the fact that they had no evidence to justify his arrest, and therefore they had to release him from jail. So, in response, the state offered to set bail, which is completely unprecedented in a case like this, because he's accused of murdering 7 children.
Right. That's pretty heinous, like heinous if true. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like
Yeah. And so Robinson sees this and he's like, you don't actually think you have a case. If you're willing to set bail, you can't think you have a case.
right.
But because things had been so highly publicized and like the hearing wouldn't be able to be kept quiet and it would be an embarrassment for them, like if it went to trial or if like anything further came out and it showed they had no evidence, like Frank Klein would either do something like really regrettable or he would be embarrassed and then like Richardson as a free man wouldn't be able to stay in the city. Like these are the thought processes Robinson's having. So he also knew that bail of any amount would basically be impossible for the Richardsons to produce because they barely make anything, and you know, up until recently they were supporting 7 children and now there's
Right.
like legal costs and all of this. But with the opportunity presented to them, he wanted to take, you know, whatever chance he had to avoid Richardson being sent to the electric chair. So he's like, you're offering bail on a mass murder trial? Sure, we'll fucking take bail.
Fuck it. Yeah, let's roll. Why
So
not?
and there's a lot of back and forth because, you know, there's the discussion of like, I can't believe we're setting bail for this guy. And then like, well, because it's 7 children, like we have to set it really high. And Robinson's like, any amount is too high because they can't make it. And so they eventually set it at $7,500. And this is estimated by the parties present to be the lowest bail ever set in the state of Florida in a murder case, and probably the lowest bail ever set in the country for multiple murder.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty low. Like, I understand, like, I fully understand that $7,500 is a lot of money, especially for 2 citrus, like, grove workers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I get that that's, like, but that's, like, nothing
Yeah.
at the same time. Like, at the same time for a murder case. Like, that's also nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. But being able to set bail avoided an embarrassing hearing. The press wasn't informed of the low bail amount, so they were trying to keep it real quiet. But local citizens were keeping their ears to the door, metaphorically, and had gathered around a large tree outside the courthouse to discuss the bail and discuss how Richardson better never be let out of jail. And the large tree was central to the point they were making.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Robinson wasn't from Arcadia. He was a white guy from elsewhere, and he was going to make bail, get his client out, and And any other case would have believed in the very real possibility of Richardson walking free. Like, this is a nothing burger of a case. He's going to go free. It's going to be fine. But that's not what happened. After Richardson was bonded out in December, a grand jury was held. Robinson knew about it and was involved enough to suggest going outside of the county to avoid an immediate indictment. But it was then held without Richardson or Robinson being present, and the principal witness of this grand jury was Sheriff Klein.
No.
So Richardson's team tried to dismiss the indictment after all that happened, and also continued to try to fight this indictment from any direction that they could. They wanted evidence produced. They wanted items taken from the home to be proscribed because they were taken without a warrant. They tried poking holes in every single part of what the prosecution was building up to look like a case. And a different judge, Judge Justice, would be hearing the case and listen to both sides regarding these pretrial concerns. And Judge Justice seemed to actually kind of side with Robinson. And the judge told Schaub that he needed more evidence to show probable cause by March 25th, 1968, or the case would be dismissed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
So this judge is like, you don't really have a case.
Yeah, he's on the right side of things.
Yeah. And at this point, the quote from My Cousin Vinny comes to mind, where Mona Lisa tells Vinny that the prosecution had to give him all his files because it's called disclosure, you dickhead. Doctor and I say that to each other all the time. Out of context, we're never discussing disclosure when we say it. But the reason for this disclosure, in part, is to share material exculpatory evidence known as Brady evidence after the 1963 Supreme Court case Brady v. Maryland. And this exculpatory evidence includes any information which is favorable to the accused and which may potentially result in a reduced sentence, as well as any evidence that challenges the credibility of an unfavored witness. So you have to give anything that you as the prosecution know and the defense doesn't necessarily know that is going to make this like an obvious...
Easier.
Yeah.
Easier for the defense.
Right. So Brady evidence has been established in 1963. However, between 1963 and 1985, the Brady rule was only applied if the defendant made a pretrial request for specific information being denied by the prosecution.
So that's basically saying they had to know
what
the evidence... Like, well, how are they supposed to know what they don't know?
Right, and that's that's the point that I think they made in 1985. They were like, how can you ask for what you don't know?
Yeah, like, I don't know this thing exists. Like, let me go fishing for it. Like, that doesn't... You're not allowed to really do that either.
Right, you're right. Like you have to just be like, I would like my Brady evidence, please. Like,
yeah. It was because he actually didn't find it, right? Right.
So they're being asked essentially for either more information or Brady evidence or whatever. And it could be that Schaub and Klein were tiptoeing around this Brady evidence just enough to avoid a mistrial if they were found out. Because they could claim that the defendant himself, this is my guess as to what they were thinking, they could claim that the defendant himself didn't ask for evidence, if that's how literally it was interpreted, or that the defense wasn't specific enough in their request.
I'm sure that they were trying to get away with the not specific enough, like, or didn't ask at all, but because it's a relatively new concept. Like.
Right. So either way, whatever they were doing with this Brady evidence, the prosecution took the demand for proving probable cause to heart. And so on March 25th, they presented new and shocking evidence to the judge. Do you remember that inmate who told Robinson that Richardson's cell was bugged?
Yes.
His name was Ernell Washington, and he was released from prison the same day that the attorneys were told to present new information or else.
Oh, good.
And
what could this mean?
He was released based on testimony given by Sheriff Klein in a deal brokered by Klein to shorten his sentence.
What a class act.
Yeah. And this new evidence in the prosecution's case was testimony from Washington announcing that Richardson admitted to him while in jail that he killed all the children.
Oh, of course it is.
And a
Like,
third...
why would it be anything else?
Right, it has to be super convenient. It has to be...
Yeah, like, why would it be anything else?
And
Like, actual evidence and not just, like, hearsay from another... Yeah, okay.
yeah, an
Sure,
inmate who's walking free because he...
Because of
inclined.
said evidence. Like,
Yeah.
quote, unquote.
Right.
Okay, sure.
And then there was a third inmate who was also in Richardson's cell. His name was James Weaver, and he testified that he also heard this admission. And this is when Robinson realized that he should have never accepted bail for Richardson, and he should have just embarrassed this county and all of these officials in that hearing. He should have just fucking done it. Because based on this development, Judge Justice revoked bail and Richardson was placed back in jail to await trial in Fort Myers. Jury selection began on May 27th, and to say it was biased would be an understatement. Robinson had to be on the lookout for known members of the KKK from the selection panel. And at this time, it was still illegal to remove possible jurors in capital cases for opposing the death penalty.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The day that evidence began to be presented, after opening statements, Sheriff Klein and Assistant State Attorney Leroy Hill carried boxes of parathion and items containing parathion to the courthouse barehanded, only to slip on yellow rubber gloves just before coming into the jury's view. They then explained that even handling these items had caused them nausea and headaches. Yeah.
Okay.
But we should be clear here. The issue was not whether or not the children were poisoned, because it's clear that they had been. James was only being tried for the death of the oldest child, though.
Oh.
Allegedly, Frank Schaub had said, if we don't get him on this one, we have 6 more tries.
What?
Yeah.
No.
So they were trying him one child at a time.
What the fuck?
Mm-hmm.
That seems like it's not okay.
It seems kind of like double jeopardy. Like
a little bit, but
yeah.
I get how it's a loophole, but like also like fuck you.
Yeah, for sure. Fuck this guy.
Fuck this guy. Like, okay.
So the question for the jury was whether or not they believe James poisoned Betty, his eldest daughter, and did so intentionally. And to convince them of this, the prosecution started to attack his character, accusing James of hating his children and wife, which everyone in town knew that he adored Annie Mae and his children. So, like, he basically just had to, like, get these 12 white people to believe that he hated his wife.
Right.
Attorneys accused him of making the children miserable by treating them poorly, by giving them little to eat or wear, and then spending any money the family had on himself, up to the point of getting life insurance with a double indemnity clause the night before their deaths in order to better himself and his place.
Which, like, to the unsuspecting juror, like, this does sound like, I mean, it's not damning evidence, but it doesn't sound nice.
The circumstantial evidence is suspicious as hell. Like,
right.
It's a citrus worker whose 7 kids were poisoned with an insecticide the day after he got some life insurance policies.
Right. Like, it doesn't, and especially, like, if that's all you heard,
if
that was all you heard, like, that doesn't sound great.
Yeah. So their first witness was the first grade teacher of Alice Richardson, who testified that Alice, which I don't understand how they were able to do this if they're only looking for, like, did he kill Betty? They, like, get the whole story for all the kids in here, but they're obviously not playing by any real set of rules. So.
No, they're playing by their own rules right now.
But so she testified that Alice had appeared healthy on the morning of October 25th, but after returning from lunch at home, she seemed to be experiencing an epileptic fit. According to this teacher, Alice was perspiring, drooling, retching, and beginning to have seizures. Susie Richardson's teacher also testified as to the symptoms of the children and said that she herself went to the Richardson home when it was clear that they needed medical attention because she knew that there were other children in the home that might be in danger. What she found were 2 of the children with Betsy Reese on her front porch. 2 doctors who attended to the children in the hospital also testified as to their presentation, and this led them to believe, as experts, that an organic phosphate had been administered orally, and this is important. They couldn't determine which chemical at the hospital, but they guessed that it was that organic phosphate family, and so they administered atropine and aminophylline for the pulmonary edema, as well as adrenaline. An oral administration was suspected because of the rapidity with which the symptoms came on, as per the descriptions by the teachers who witnessed the children fall ill. Robinson himself was never able to interview Betsy Reese or Charlie Smith because Sheriff Klein had interviewed them to his own satisfaction for the case. Both had also been jailed during the investigation as witnesses, and although Klein said Reese's arrest was related to her parole, the prosecution would not allow the reason for Reese's parole to come to light in front of the jury. So for all they know, this next-door neighbor to the Robinsons who fed the children the morning they fell ill and was found with 2 of them as they suffered convulsions might have just had a traffic violation on her record. No big deal. In reality, this woman was on parole for the murder of her husband and was suspected of poisoning another husband to death, and a third allegedly left her for one of the Richardsons' cousins. So she was holding a grudge, allegedly. Yes.
Whoa.
Like, how many
that
arrows
seems
do you
important.
need?
That seems super duper important right now.
Yeah, they know
Like,
it's important.
Like, super duper important. I cannot put enough emphasis on the duper right now.
That's why they're not letting any of this come to light. They're like, okay, thank you. Okay, you can go now.
Holy shit.
Like, could you get enough arrows pointing at this woman?
Right. No.
Yeah, so they never hear from Betsy Reese herself, their best witness. And then on the second day of testimony, the jury hears from Dr. Edward Davis, the director of Community Pesticide Studies for the State Board of Health, and an expert on parathion. He informed the court that parathion was developed by the Nazis when Hitler was considering using chemical warfare, but it was never implemented in that way. And although this is true, I don't know that I would present it that way in court. Like, it's...
Right. Like, that's pretty...
It's color, for sure. Yeah. But yeah, it was invented by Dr. Gerhard Schrader during his employment at none other than I.G. Farben, during which time he also invented Tabun and Sarin. And all of these drugs were initially investigated as nerve agents because of their known effects when used as insecticides. And parathion, like many of these insecticides, is a cholinergic drug, meaning it enhances the effect of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the body. And we've talked about this at length before. But exposure to these cholinergic drugs like sarin and parathion does result in those sludge symptoms: salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, GI distress, and emesis, as well as stimulation of muscles that lead to spasms. And that's why the children appeared to be having like epileptic fits. These spasms can include bronchospasms that make it very hard to breathe. And then it can also result in flaccid paralysis and brachycardia. Death from exposure to these chemicals typically sets in due to respiratory paralysis, though it is also possible to occur via renal failure. Like sarin, the cholinergic drug we discussed in the Om Shinrikyo series, parathion is an irreversible acetylcholine agonist, which can have devastating effects when administered topically, orally, or inhalationally.
So it's like not a good vibe.
It's not.
Like,
it's really
okay.
not. I don't know how we managed to use it as an insecticide for as long as we did.
Yeah, it seems pretty intense.
It is.
Pretty intense.
It is. In Florida alone, between 1945 and 1964, 30 children died from accidental exposure to parathion, which was set on windowsills to kill roaches or improperly stored in soda bottles. You know, you set a little bit aside so you can use it in small portions.
Ugh.
Those who ingested it...
And that was just in Florida?
That's in
Just
Florida,
in Florida
alone, between 1945 and 1964, so just before this case.
That's crazy.
So those children who ingested it orally either died upon arrival to the ER or within 3 hours of exposure, much like the Richardson children, which is why the doctors believed that it was an oral route of administration.
Mm-hmm.
The estimated lethal dose of parathion is 2 to 13 milligrams per kilogram for adults, or approximately 140 to 910 milligrams for a 150-pound person. So that's a pretty wide range But, every person is different. In children, though, it's only 0.1 to 1.3 milligrams per kilogram.
Mm.
And that's a fairly insignificant amount. The upper end for adults is less than approximately a quarter teaspoon. So for kids, you need nothing.
Right.
Most of these facts were not made known to the jury in 1968. They were told about
good.
Hitler.
Yeah, great. Good great grand. They're like, it was considered for chemical warfare, and this guy killed his kids.
Right.
All right.
Right.
Case closed.
Right. They might have known about some of the other kids. They might have heard about it. They might have known about the general danger. But what they did hear was testimony that made it clear that most poisonings of children were accidental oral ingestions. They were then informed inadvertently by the defense, who was just like, the grove that employed Richardson did not use Parathion.
Oh.
Yeah, so that accidentally slipped out. Dr. Davis and his team performed the tissue analyses on the children to verify Parathion in their systems. And he testified that, quote, values in these children were some of the highest we have ever encountered.
Ugh.
And that they were given a lot of Parathion. He also assisted with the timeline of ingestion by saying that the magnitude of the amount found in Betty, coupled with the knowledge that we obtained that they were all in perfect health at the school, almost certainly suggests that the poison was ingested after leaving school going home to lunch. Right? So we got this real narrow window.
Narrow window. Like, we know when it happened, pretty much. Like,
yes, and we know
pretty much.
At the time that it happened, the Richardson parents were 16 miles away in the same citrus orchard that they'd been in all morning. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, what are you going to make of that prosecution?
Yeah, that's pretty rough.
Right.
Like,
this timeline also helps to rule out other modes of exposure, though, because if they were exposed via inhalation and the symptoms set in around noon, that would indicate an exposure sometimes closer to 5 a.m., in which case the parents also would likely be showing some indication of exposure around the same time as the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Dermal exposure would also result in delayed presentation of symptoms, but in the case of an entire household being exposed, it would be unlikely to have dermal exposure without also having oral exposure, which, again, would have the symptoms setting in sooner.
Right.
That inmate informer, Ernell Washington, whose testimony sprung him from jail and led to the rearrest of James Richardson, did not testify.
Surprise.
Well, he had a special reason.
Oh.
But between the preliminary hearing and the trial, Washington was shot to death by a woman in a bar.
Oh.
And then the local paper decided to make this out to be some kind of conspiracy on behalf of James Richardson.
Give me a break.
I know.
Give me a break.
I know. But the other inmates testified, and they said that James put the Parathion he got from the citrus grove at work, which they don't use Parathion at this grove.
That they don't use.
Right.
This imaginary Parathion.
He put it into the grits that Annie Mae prepared for the children the morning of October 25th. And she then heated it up and set it aside. I guess it wasn't eaten for breakfast. I don't know what the story is supposed to be. Again, it falls to pieces as soon as you look at it too hard.
Right.
The death of the other children in James's care did also come up because Klein has that in his back pocket. But it was only mentioned enough to make him seem like a monster of a father, and not in a way that provided any context to the jury, which is completely unsurprising. What happened was in 1963, James's infant son, who he had with his then wife Margie, died from extreme vomiting, and this turned out to be from eating uncooked beans.
Oh.
As a result of this death, which was an accident, Margie took her other 3 kids with her to Detroit and then blamed James for the death and was like, I don't want my kids around you. You're going to somehow end up hurting them in the same way. But it was declared to be like a natural death. And so nobody thought that James was malicious or suspicious. It was just Margie.
Mm. She wanted somebody to blame.
Yeah, I mean, she lost a baby, you know.
Right.
It was tragic, but it was more of an accident than a pattern. And that's why much of the information was withheld by the prosecution. Just enough to be suspicious.
To sprinkle the suspicion in.
Yeah. So rather than there being 5 to 6 children, it was this one baby that died in an accident. After 7 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 hours, after which they declared that 32-year-old James Richardson was guilty and sentenced him to death.
Wow.
According to the alternate juror, who saw the whole trial but did not vote in the decision and was therefore able to speak, someone had to do it, and he could have done it. Yeah, this juror also used a racial slur that I decided to not include in a quote. So...
Very cool.
Yeah.
Love that. Why? Okay. Sure.
Yeah. So, Richardson served time on death row from 1968 to 1973 in Rayford Prison in Bradford County, North Florida. At several points, the prison performed dry runs for the execution on Richardson and the other death row inmates so that they wouldn't be surprised when the time came. They went so far as to shave Richardson's head and walked him down to the execution chamber, where they actually strapped him into the chair, turned on the power, and then stopped there.
Oh my god.
And then
that's traumatizing.
Fuck yeah. Like, oh my god.
Jesus.
Like, why don't you just lay down in this guillotine and then go back to your cell? Like,
yeah.
Fuck, dude.
Jeez. Yeah. That's fucked up.
The reason he only stayed on death row until 1973 is because in 1972, the Furman v. Georgia Supreme Court decision found death penalty an unconstitutional infringement on the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Do you know much about this case?
I don't.
Apparently, when it happened, just 600 men across the country were immediately taken off death row.
Okay.
More than half of whom were black, and this was part of their finding, was that minorities were disproportionately harmed by the death penalty.
Who's surprised by that?
Not me.
Yeah.
So, the inmates didn't have their cases revisited. Their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole.
Oh, righteous.
And Richardson is one of these 600, but he was denied parole on the basis that he did not show any remorse for a crime that he did not commit.
Oh, okay.
And Frank Schaub attended Richardson's parole hearing. He attended all of his parole hearings. And he said it was explicitly to make sure that Richardson never got out.
What a guy.
Yeah.
What a guy you are, Frank Schaub.
Yeah.
Like, cool.
And the thing about Schaub's involvement is that his highly publicized trial against F. Lee Bailey that I mentioned up top probably gave him some credibility as a prosecutor in a poisoning case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Prior to 1967, because these cases happened in the same year, it was believed that the succinylcholine chloride used in the Coppolino double murder trial was undetectable in the human body. But Schaub worked closely with the New York City chief medical examiner and his toxicologist to find traces of the drug in human tissue, which, like, that's cool. That's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
The route of administration and the dose was critical to Schaub winning the case. And while I don't expect lawyers involved in one poison case to know everything about another poison, I find it hard to believe he didn't understand the basics of parathion and poisoning based on his involvement in this case.
Right.
So it's like
some of that knowledge is transferable.
Right.
Yeah.
And he had to have known that they didn't have a case. He didn't think they had a case before they originally tried Richardson. And now he's showing up to his parole hearings to make sure that this guy he knows is innocent stays in prison for the rest of his life.
Right. Get a life.
Yeah.
Like, get a life.
Fucking for real. Richardson was transferred several times. He eventually learned to read, earned his GED, and became an ordained minister. He hoped to someday get out of prison and start a new life. And in 1988, new evidence finally came to light that made that dream possible. And that evidence was the confession of none other than Betsy Reese, who was now living in a nursing home with signs of Alzheimer's. She made confessions, plural, to her nurse about 100 times before the nurse finally decided to tell somebody and then signed an affidavit about the statements. Like, yeah,
oh my God.
This woman who, like, I know was in this case because I've read about it keeps telling me she killed these kids. The nurse didn't think that she was incompetent. Like, she was repeating these stories a lot and, like, seemed like she was still there. But Reese was found mentally unfit to give an official confession, and so Richardson was denied a new trial.
No.
I know!
Damn.
After Richardson's imprisonment, Treadwell began drinking heavily. At one point, his secretary claims he said, "We almost killed an innocent man. That's why I drink now," and indicated he had files related to the Richardson case in his office. Then he started doing some housekeeping that this secretary found suspicious, and so she stole one of Treadwell's keys, gave it to her boyfriend, who was like kind of a known petty thief. He broke into the office and he retrieved this box of files.
Okay.
But then they had to hold on to it because they like open it up and they're like, "Oh, it does contain this evidence," and it has fucking a ton of evidence in it. It has everything that was withheld from the defense in the original trial. It has depositions, notes on grand jury proceedings, like basically the blueprints of a conspiracy are in this box.
Ugh.
But because the contents were stolen,
Right.
they had to wait for the statute of limitations to expire on that crime. And in 1988, the limitations expired. They give up the box, and it falls into the possession of Mark Lane, who's the author of Arcadia Revisited and the lawyer who comes to represent Richardson. Lane managed to get these files to the governor's office in October in 1988, and the governor decided that the case needed to be revisited.
Okay.
He granted Janet Reno the power to investigate, like, big Janet Reno.
Right, like BFD Janet Reno.
Yes. And so this meant that the small town bullshit has to stop now because Janet Reno's stepping in, and the Arcadia courthouse was forced to hand over everything they had on the Richardson case to determine if the 1968 trial had been fair.
Mm.
And obviously they found that it wasn't fair, and it was a huge miscarriage of justice, and they never even tried to make it fair. And so they held a new trial in Arcadia again in 1989, and the judge granted James Joseph Richardson his immediate freedom.
Let's go.
Yes. And the first thing he did was get the fuck out of Arcadia.
Smart man. Smart man.
Yeah. But after 21 years of imprisonment, freedom was difficult. Annie Mae stayed by his side for his entire prison sentence, but James filed for divorce just months after his release and then married his new wife, Teresa, in early 1990. He made several television appearances, he did a lot of interviews, but he wasn't paid for any of these, and he didn't get any money from the trial, so he had very little to live off now that he was free. He was able to file a wrongful conviction suit against DeSoto County, which settled for $150,000, but much of that went to the legal expenses he'd been racking up since 1968.
Yeah.
In 2008, the Florida legislature enacted a new statute that would allow James to apply for compensation from Florida. It was called the Victims of Wrongful Incarceration Act, but it required DNA evidence, and it required that the applicants prove their innocence. So rather than, like, when you're at trial, you have to prove that somebody is guilty, they have to, like, provide substantial proof of their innance.
Right.
And he couldn't do that, and he didn't have... Right, and he didn't have DNA evidence, so he's like...
Right, DNA evidence doesn't apply to this case.
Right.
Like, that's not a thing in this case.
Right.
Well, that's unfortunate.
New legislation was then introduced in 2013 and signed into law in June of 2014. And this bill provides compensation to anyone wrongfully incarcerated before December 31st, 1979, whose case was reversed by a special prosecutor's review. Meaning that it only applies to James Richardson.
All right.
This entitled him to $50,000 for every of the 21 years he was wrongfully imprisoned, to total over $1 million distributed in 10 checks for $112,000 each year until 2025.
Okay.
And $25,000 from each check would automatically go to his lawyers and lobbyists.
Okay.
And
everybody's getting paid.
He's getting paid. Yeah. And in 2016, so it took a bit. It took a minute. He was like, but
hello?
yeah. In 2016, he received his first check for compensation, and then he died in September of 2023 in Wichita, Kansas at age 87. In 1993, Frank Schaub was suspended for practicing law for 30 days for knowingly making false statements to a tribunal and knowingly failing to disclose material fact to a tribunal.
For this case or for a different case?
No, for a different case.
Oh, so he's a serial offender.
Yes. Yes.
Got it. Okay.
And the suspension, it appears, is the only time that he was ever in any way slapped on the wrist or anything for these offenses.
Right.
Yeah. And he died in 1995. Frank Klein died in 2013. Neither Klein nor Schaub faced any sort of punishment for their part in the conspiracy against James Richardson and maintained their positions on his guilt until their deaths. Betsy Reese died in 1992. The EPA terminated registration for all Parathion products in the United States in 2006, 5 years after the EU banned it, though it does remain legal to use, or at least is unregulated to use, in some poorer countries around the world. Parathion is broken down by sunlight and microorganisms, but some low levels may still exist in soil previously treated with the insecticide.
Oh, wow.
In fact, as of 2017, Parathion was detected in soil in 20 out of the 1,832 sites on the current and former National Priorities list of Superfund sites. Which, 20 out of 1,000 isn't terrible, but it's still, being detected, so...
It's still not good. It still has a viable presence. That's not good. And, for how long?
Right. Right. So, this means that there is still some chance, though it's very low, primarily for agricultural workers to be exposed to it via inhalation, dermal, or oral exposure. So, what do we take away from all of this? I mean, certainly we can be thankful for toxicological evidence that clearly points to obvious perpetrators, but what good is that if the prosecution is going to, have a conspiracy against the defense?
Right, because even if we had more evidence, better evidence, from the toxicology standpoint, I don't think that would have mattered in this case one bit.
I don't think so.
One bit, unfortunately.
Yeah.
This was sad.
Yeah. I'm glad he eventually got out, but he spent 21 years in prison. That's fucked up. You can't give him that time back. And Betsy Reese was never tried or punished for killing his 7 kids.
Right. She got to live her life, and I mean, probably not guilt-free because it got to her at some point, but it wasn't until she was a sick old woman that it got to her. He got institutionalized, got 20 years of his life robbed from him, had, if he would have had those 20 years of freedom, he would have never had to reacclimate. He would have never had to go through that process again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tragic.
While some things have changed for the better since 1968, other things have barely changed or changed for the worse. In 1976, the Supreme Court decision in Gregg v. Georgia resulted in the reinstatement of the death penalty in Georgia, Florida, and Texas. As of October 2024, there were 2,183 people across 29 jurisdictions who were on death row in the United States, including 283 in Florida. That's the number 2 highest state for the death penalty. 174 of these people in Florida were sentenced following a non-unanimous jury vote or a judicial override.
Wow.
And 35% of them are black, despite Florida's black population being only around 17%.
Imagine.
And then in 2011, the Supreme Court decision on Connick v. Thompson argued that a DA may not be held liable for failure to train its prosecutors based on a single Brady violation. Although in this Supreme Court case alone, the DA committed more than one Brady violation, so it seems like the offenses of the prosecution will be defended almost no matter what, while the lives of innocent people are literally at risk of being ended by capital punishment for crimes they didn't commit.
Yeah, the worst possible outcome for innocent people. Can we Can we not ignore that? Like,
Right. I mean, I'm glad that, like, our state, Colorado, has abolished the death penalty because at least, like, we can't do that to people. But, you know, Richardson was eventually taken off of death row and just had to, like, waste his life away in prison.
well, he wasted his life away in prison, and I wonder, like, if he was still somehow on death row when they got it returned. Like,
Oh,
would
yeah.
do you know what I mean? Like, would they, like, how does that work? Could they have put him back on death row?
Yeah, I don't know.
Do you know what I, like, because
Who
that would
knows?
be fucked up if you're like,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
JK, we were just kidding
I mean,
about the possibility of parole.
I kind of think they would have because I think that if you, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. They might have, though, just because it was Florida. But if they were like, we took you off death row because of a technicality in the 70s that's been fixed, and we revisited your case and we found that, like, everything was totally fine and as it should have been originally, like, I could see them putting him back on death row. That'd be fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, I could see it too.
Yeah.
I could see it too, and that's what I was thinking about. Like, that is fucked up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, damn.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a bittersweet one.
Yeah.
Little, like, yeah, that was rough. A
Yeah.
little rough. I'm not
Well,
bittersweet. That was a little rough.
this won't be the last time we're talking about the death penalty this season, so
All
prepare
right.
yourself for that, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're not thoroughly convinced that the death penalty should be abolished, maybe I'll convince you. Maybe I have an agenda, or maybe
By
I don't
the
know.
end of this season,
yeah.
see how
Yeah.
you feel.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe go touch some grass or something after listening to this episode. Go into some sunshine.
Good call. Good call. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus Daneko. Stay safe, and remember,
The dose makes the poison.